purpose of this session is for you to see the power of the unconscious and how one person, I'm going to give a little bit of a commentary through a section of something that's called The Century of the Self, which gives you a picture of Edward Bernays, who was the first person who very much used the unconscious as a ways and means of manipulating it as far as the masses are concerned. So this is a documentary. What I'm simply going to do is play parts of it and then give you a perspective from an intuitive, sensitive point of view. Now, you probably think that the unconscious is this deep thing that is slightly scary, and certainly something that you think perhaps is uncontrolled or uncontrollable. What I'm going to show you through this section is how there has been a huge influence on the unconscious through society, certainly since the 1920s, which is pretty much coming up to one full 100 years, and for you to see how you can perhaps adjust that or realize it as you move forward. So what I'll be doing is playing little sections of this and then stopping it, giving a little bit of a commentary on it as to how you can see it from your perspective. So listen up and you'll find something very interesting.
Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
There we go. So Edward Bernays thought, well, maybe I can make some money from manipulating the unconscious. They pretty much said it as such. It's really quite clear. And he used his Uncle Freud's thoughts on psychoanalysis in order to explore that as an idea. Now, to make it quite clear that Freud did not work with Edward Bernays to do this. This was a case of one person, so Freud's nephew, taking his work and seeing whether that could be utilized and to create something for the masses, or in terms of controlling or manipulating the mass unconscious. Okay, so let's carry on.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision making. Not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior.
There we go. So how you can look at this is the group unconscious. Now, we are very much aware of that as intuitive sensitives. You pick up on that every day. You pick up on that in the world around you. You pick up on that in terms of people, situations, all kinds of things. And you feel it more in the emotions. Most people don't really feel it at all. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're not reacting to it.
He began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie...
There we go. If the thought that you could just allow yourself to make decisions from facts isn't the full picture, and you know that as an intuitive sensitive, you know that your emotions play a huge part in it. So one of the key things for us to remember as an intuitive sensitive is that you can be in charge of that. Why is that easier for us? Because we're more aware of our emotions. We're more aware of what we feel at any one time.
That was not the way the world worked.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that?
Okay, so the person on screen right now is an elderly Edward Bernays. This was obviously him right at the end of his career path. And he is talking about, in this particular section, one of his very early schemes, so to speak, which was to start the process of women smoking. Now watch this really carefully, because it's both fascinating and shocking, and how this really came about, okay? And that this was how women began to smoke, was really the manipulation of one man. And this is the man that you are about to, well, that you can see on screen right now, but see how he did it.
I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America. And for a large fee, he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came.
Okay, so did you ever think that actually you were, as a woman, that you were somehow or another envious of a man's appenditure? Well, that is how Edward Bernays used, or what he used as a way, as a means to start this process of mentally figuring out how you could make women smoke, because at the time they weren't smoking, and because it was seen as something that was outside of what was polite for women to do. So this was about rebellious women. Okay, so this was, and we're very familiar with that, again, as an intuitive sensitive. You can feel when you want to go up against something. But the key thing to remember here is, do you want to go up against something because you want to go up against something, or is there something being in your world that you are being manipulated to go up against? So have a look at this in terms of, this is the big moment where Edward Bernays used what he found out from the psychoanalysis to manipulate the masses. Okay, so watch this part carefully.
And Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom.
There we go. So how did Edward Bernays do this? He took it from a idea. How did he take something from an idea where women wouldn't participate, which was smoking, right from there to going through psychoanalysis and looking at it from that perspective as to why women didn't smoke, how to get them into that stage of being rebellious and starting smoking, and then using an Easter parade in order to promote what it was, or to manipulate what he wanted, and then to have a word or to have an association with something that gave him a very clear way of being able to utilize that later, which was torches of freedom. How does that impact us as an intuitive sensitive, well, we are very geared towards the word freedom. Not to say that we would suddenly start to smoke, but what I'm saying is that there are sometimes these contradictions that we feel inside of ourselves, and we begin to wonder, is this something that I'm choosing to do, or is this something that I feel manipulated into doing? Now, the key is, for you as an intuitive sensitive, you can begin to feel that there is something that's going up against it, something that's pushing, even if you're not able to identify it. Whereas somebody else, someone who's not a sensitive, someone who's not, and certainly not an intuitive sensitive, would perhaps blindly not notice these things. So when you start to feel that there is some kind of internal conflict up against something, and it doesn't make sense in the external world because everyone else finds it acceptable, it doesn't mean to say that it is acceptable. It may simply mean that you've noticed it earlier. Carry on.
And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch. You see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense.
Therefore, we can see this. If it's a phrase that works in a rational sense, we could see it as maybe the balancing of the left and right hemisphere of how it's trying to manipulate that, which is the left hemisphere in terms of your rational thoughts and the right hemisphere in terms of your emotions and emotional thoughts. So if you were looking at it in terms of the unconscious, you could say that much of how it is geared in life and how we focus on something that is unconscious is through the emotion. Okay, so through our emotional self, through our emotions and how we see that. For you as an intuitive sensitive, you can feel the emotions more readily than the average person.
All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet embrace.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and...
Well, that is a slightly scary bit, which is Edward Bernays began to realize that you could link people's irrational emotions to products, so to actual physical things. You can relate your emotions to objects, and you could say that this maybe is one of those times, or one of the earlier times, where things began to be objectified.
The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
How you wanted to be seen by others. One of the things as intuitive sensitives that we need to overcome is the fact that we worry about how we're seen by others. So how you think yourself as being seen by another person, is it real or is it not real? Is it something that's been manipulated over a period of time? Is it something that has been in charge of your unconscious, that has maybe been placed in front of you rather than how it is, how you actually feel? Okay, one of the clear messages so far that you can look at as far as this is concerned is that it's very possible to manipulate aspects of the unconscious, and certainly on a mass scale. But for you as an intuitive sensitive, you can feel that there is something going on. You can feel that something is there, even if the world around you looks as though it seems to be okay with them, so surely it must be okay with me.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing.
If you ever wondered why you end up with too much stuff, this could well be the very reason why you end up with too many things, is because it's been manipulated through the lines that actually you don't necessarily need that, but you feel like you need that. So as an intuitive sensitive, we understand that. We really kind of get that. You can feel that you should have it or that you should need it. And then what we do very well is justify why we've got that afterwards, whether that is to ourselves or to another person. But question is, why do we justify it? Can we feel that actually we didn't really make that full decision? Or is it that we've decided to have it and therefore feel guilty for the reason that we've wanted to have it, because maybe in the past we felt that we've accumulated something that we didn't want, and now we feel guilty for the things we actually do want? Where does it get confused, and how does it get confused, and how do we know which part is ours and which part is something that society has said that we should consume, we should have, we should accumulate? It becomes a big question. But the point of this is for you to see that actually somebody else at some point did very much have an influence, whether it was Edward Bernays in your own lifetime of having an influence. Certainly how things have been marketed since Edward Bernays' days still remains very much the same.
That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
What Bernays was doing fascinated America's corporations. They had come out of the war rich and powerful.
Now this is a key part, this next part is a key part for you to listen for and be really quite, okay, this is a clear picture as to how certain things have occurred. And if you have thought, well, I feel manipulated by something bigger than buying a handbag or buying a pair of shoes or buying a car, then this next section may give you a few answers.
But they had a growing worry. The system of mass production had flourished during the war, and now millions of goods were pouring off production lines. What they were frightened of was the danger of overproduction, that there would come a point when people had enough goods and would simply stop buying. Up until that point, the majority of products were still sold to the masses on the basis of need. While the rich had long been used to luxury goods, for the millions of working-class Americans, most products were still advertised as necessities.
So, as you can see, around the time of the Second World War, well, actually, no, I think this is more around the First World War, that products were sold on the basis of need rather than want. Post-war, worrying about production lines, they then decided that actually maybe this needs to change from a need to a want. It's an up.
Goods like shoes, stockings, even cars were promoted in functional terms for their durability. The aim of the advertisements was simply to show people the product's practical virtues, nothing more. What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture.
There we go. That's the clear indication. We must shift America from a needs to a want culture. Now, this is, you could look at this as the beginnings of how society has been manipulated to consume, the beginnings of the conscious beginnings of how we made the switch through a very short period of time into a needs to a wants. Okay, and how certainly as an intuitive sensitive, we feel guilty if we don't want. It's almost as though we think we should want that because everybody else wants it. And it feels odd that we don't want it, but we think we should do. And it feels contradictory to what everybody else does. So if you've felt ever that what you want seems contradictory to everybody else, is it? Or is it that you're beginning to feel your own truth?
People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
Prior to that time, there was no American consumer. There was the American worker, and there was the American owner, and they manufactured and they saved and they ate what they had to, and the people shopped for what they needed. And while the very rich may have bought things they didn't need, most people did not. And Mazur envisioned a break with that where you would have things that you didn't actually need, but you wanted, as opposed to needed.
And the man who would be at the centre of changing that mentality for the corporations was Edward Bernays.
Here he pops up again. We've seen that he started this whole perception of manipulation of the unconscious, thought, maybe this is something we can play with. And then seeing it through the corporation's viewpoint, which is, well, we need to shift people from a needs to a wants culture. How do we do that? Well, we put this figure who knows how to work with the mass unconscious, stick him in there, and we'll start to program people to shift from a needs to a wants perspective. Now you might think, well, I'm not sure I've been on the receiving end of that manipulation. I'm not sure, really have I? Well, the thing is, even if you haven't been, as an intuitive sensitive, maybe you've been immune to that. But the fact is, those you know and love, you know and you can see, they have externalized things in life. They've seen their value, their worth, determined by the external world, by other factors, how much they've got, what they're doing, how much they work, how much they can provide for. And if they can't, the key thing is to allow accumulation of debt. If you don't want it, if you can't have it now, is to get debt to acquire it, because you have no standing unless you do these things. Where does that come from? Where does that mentality come from? And is it part of something that, even if you perhaps don't want to be part of, it is part of your external world? And maybe you, as an intuitive sensitive, have tried to remove yourself from that, and you've thought, why are people so shallow, so to speak? And maybe the real answer is that they're not really shallow, they just haven't been able to see. And you have been perhaps a little bit more able to notice that, but haven't necessarily known what it is or how it occurred.
Bernays really is the guy within the United States more than anybody else who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment and sales establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud. I mean, they are ready for understanding what motivates the human mind. And so that there's this real openness to Bernays' techniques being used to sell products to the masses.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer.
The outlet department stores, Bernays' job was to provide the new types of customer. We've all done it as intuitive sensitives. We've gone into department stores, and if you're anything like me, you've done the perfume dash. You've rushed through the hall of perfumes and things sprayed in your face, and it feels uncomfortable. It doesn't quite feel comfortable. It may be that you have a sensitivity to the perfumes, and you may think that doesn't smell like perfume. It smells like chemicals to me. There may be something that you just feel is a bit off or out of sync, or something that you can't quite fall into. What has it been? Maybe it has been that it feels like you're being drawn into a constructed rather than a natural world of where you feel comfortable. Does that mean that you're wrong? No, but it means that you are aware of the unconscious.
Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines, and Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow, who was also his client. Bernays also began the practice of product placement in the movies, and he dressed the stars at the film's premieres with clothes and jewellery from other firms he represented.
There we go. That's the beginning of how things have been. If you've ever wondered, wow, is this whole movie star thing, celebrity endorsement, fake? Is it part of a manipulation? Is it something that they really would use or not? Or are they just trying to persuade me? Well, this is quite a clear indication that guess who started it? And yes, we still have that very much today, which is the whole celebrity endorsement thing. Where does it come from? It comes from Mr. Bernays.
He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you, and then pretended they were independent studies.
Pretended that they were independent studies. This is where this level of manipulation gets very scary, in my view. There is a difference between helping someone to understand something and then taking a role, which is the overseer. And in my view, this is how this switches to come into this overseer, that I will be the overseer of what you consume. So Edward Bernays almost became the overseer of what people would be told was good for them. And it was all done very subtly, very much without people's knowledge. But for you as an intuitive sensitive, you will have suspected that there was something, but you would have perhaps assumed it was you with the problem, rather than feeling that actually you were walking into something that felt fake, because it was. Perhaps you're now starting to think, wow, I can see how I've been drawn into this, and I can see how I've also felt like I've wanted to withdraw from it. And perhaps you should now be starting to see the reasons why.
He organised fashion shows in the department stores and paid celebrities to repeat the new and essential message. You bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself to others.
How you construct your worth, which is through the eyes of others. This, again, is something that you could perhaps say isn't the real way of how things work. It's a constructed way of being able to see things in terms of how goods have been marketed to you and told to you that it's a grand and great way to do stuff. Perhaps now you can see how through your family generations, this marketing indoctrination, so to speak, has filtered through. How perhaps you've been a rebel within that because you have felt that it didn't quite gel with you, but you thought that you should be this or you should be that, because it would mean that that person would accept you and feel love for you, because that was the way that they've been told love is shown, or how feelings are assumed to be. If you ever wondered whether lots of these things have been constructed, perhaps you can see now that it's highly likely that they have, and that you can see that there's a whole depth as far as the unconscious is concerned. So if somebody else, a man you never met, Edward Bernays, can have an influence over it, hopefully you can now see that if someone else can have an influence over it, your unconscious, then you can have a much bigger influence over it once you know what are the parts that are you and what are the parts that have been constructed to be an idea of you. See you next time. Bye for now.